Sheriff Barber's office.
Yes, this is Valerie Maynard. One of my employees did not show up for work this afternoon, which is totally uncharacteristic of her. I want to put her house now. I just went in her home because I'm so worried about her. There's everywhere.
Don't go back in the house.
Welcome back to another episode of Killer Bites. Today, I'll be telling you about the tragic and horrific case of Sarah Maynard, who survived unthinkable circumstances before her rescue in a leaf-covered basement days later. It all began on Wednesday, November 10th, 2010, in Apple Valley, Ohio, when Tina Herman didn't show up to her job at the local Dairy Queen. Valerie Haythorne, Tina's coworker, was alarmed by her absence, and she had good reason to be. Fearing for Tina's safety, Valerie went to Tina's house after work. There, she saw Tina's car in the driveway with another unknown car. The lights in the house were on. Valerie knocked on the door, but there was no answer. And Valerie knew something was not right. So, Valerie called the police and told the dispatcher that Tina hadn't shown up for work, wasn't responding to texts, and now wasn't answering the door. Valerie told the dispatcher that Tina's car was in the driveway and her coat was in her house, but she was not there. Valerie added that one of her sources of concern was that Tina had recently broken up with her boyfriend. She told the dispatcher that Tina's boyfriend could also be a real jerk with her. But when they arrived, they knocked and also got no response. So, the deputies left the matter unresolved. But the very next day, an officer called East Knox Schools to find out if Tina's two children, Sarah and Cody, had been in school. They were informed that the kids had been in school on Wednesday, but that they hadn't shown up on Thursday. This does not sound good. Meanwhile, not long after, another 911 call came in about another missing woman. This woman, Stephanie L. Sprang, happened to be Tina's best friend. The police were told by Stephanie's boyfriend that she had been with Tina before he lost contact with her. Stephanie's boyfriend told the dispatcher that the last time he had talked to her was around midday on Wednesday, and by Thursday, a now very worried Valerie decided to go back to Tina's house. She then noticed that Tina's car was no longer in the driveway. However, the unknown car was left there. What investigators later discovered was that the vehicle belonged to Stephanie, but what had happened to Tina's car? Where had it gone? When Valerie returned to Tina's house, she decided to break into the house to see if she could find any clues as to what happened. She used an unlocked window on the back porch to get in. Once she was inside, Valerie saw a truly horrible and gruesome sight. There was splattered in the bathroom and throughout the house. She quickly left the house and called the police again.
I want to put her house now. I just went in her home because I'm so worried about her. There's everywhere.
Don't go back in the house.
By Friday, November 12th, the police were officially investigating 4 disappearances. Tina and her 2 children, Sarah and Cody, as well as Tina's best friend, Stephanie. The family dog was also missing from the house. The house was searched for clues, and the early discoveries were very disheartening. The investigators concluded from the amount of blood in the house that there was assault with bodily injury, and there was a large amount of with drag marks that led to the bathroom. There was also in the basement stairs and in the basement itself. Thanks so much for watching Killer Bites. If you like our channel, subscribe. Now, let's get back to the story. While investigators knew something terrible had happened in the home, they still didn't know exactly what, and if any of these poor victims were still alive. The first suspect in the investigation was Tina's ex-boyfriend, Gregory Borders. Gregory was the first person that police brought in for questioning in this case, and he admitted that he and Tina had just split up, but they were still living in the house together until they could make their own arrangements. What police found extremely interesting about Gregory is that he normally had Wednesdays off, the day that Tina first went missing. But that particular Wednesday, he decided to work overtime at his job. His office was about an hour and a half away, so he decided to stay at a friend's house that night. He told the police that he had plans to play golf that Thursday with his friend. Gregory had even been called about Tina missing work, but assumed she'd just taken the day off. When Gregory returned home, the investigators had already started their investigation. Once the police finished their investigation, Gregory's family arrived with bleach to clean up the so that he wouldn't have to see it. And with Gregory cleared, investigators had to move on to other leads. The next development happened that Thursday when Tina's car was found on a nearby college campus abandoned. There was no sign of Tina, Stephanie, Sarah, or Cody. And that would lead investigators to examine the evidence back at Tina's house again. That's when they discovered a single Walmart bag that had 2 tarps and a box of heavy-duty trash bags. The small discovery became the investigation's big break in the case. Because along with the shopping bags, investigators also found a receipt for the purchase. Detectives wasted no time and quickly got the footage from the local Walmart. They began looking for someone making a suspicious purchase of garbage bags and tarps. And it wasn't long before they found him, their suspect, buying the items just after midnight on Thursday. They were able to get a description of the suspect in the car he was driving at the time, a silver Toyota Yaris. Using still images of the suspect, the investigators used the Ohio Law Enforcement Gateway to search for any owners of the suspect's car. From that, they were able to find the name of the suspect, and it was Matthew J. Hoffman. The police knew they needed to find Matthew, but he had 2 possible addresses. One belonged to his mother, who lived less than half a mile from Tina's home, and the other address registered to him was only 10 miles from Tina's home. Both properties imply that he perhaps could have known Tina and her children. It was also discovered that Matthew had been stopped by a police car near where Tina's abandoned car was found. The officer stopped him to ask why he was in the area, but believing nothing was amiss, he had let him go. A big mistake that could have ended the torture of a young girl days earlier. The investigators also discovered that Matthew had a record of domestic violence with his then living girlfriend. During an argument, Matthew allegedly choked his now ex-girlfriend, and then, following the breakup, the police quickly contacted Matthew's ex-girlfriend and found out that he no longer lived with his mother. Finally, the police knew where to continue their search for Tina, Sarah, Cody, and Stephanie, and that was at Matthew's house. Once the search warrants were obtained by the police, a SWAT team was unleashed upon Matthew's home. Because they were not sure if the victims had been abducted, they used a no-knock entry and a battery ram to force their entry into the house. So, what did the police find once in the house? This is one of the more bizarre and haunting things in the case. When police entered the residence, they found Matthew asleep on the sofa and an amazing amount of leaves. Yes, you heard that right. Matthew was quickly arrested and removed from the home. After he was safely contained, the police began to examine the huge piles of leaves everywhere. To put it in perspective, the entire living room floor was almost completely covered in leaves. And there were also bags of leaves lining every wall of the bathroom. Then, police found 2 dead squirrels in the freezer next to some popsicles. But the biggest surprise was still hidden in the basement. A large cabinet was blocking the doorway to the basement, but once it was moved, an officer discovered Tina's daughter, Sarah Maynard. She was laying on a sleeping bag on top of another pile of leaves. Her feet and hands were bound with yellow rope and duct tape. Alongside Sarah in the basement were more trash bags filled with leaves. Thankfully, Sarah appeared to be unharmed, but she was wearing a makeshift diaper made from a plastic bag. As officers approached her, she was very confused and kept asking the officers if she was late for school. Sarah also asked if they knew what happened to her dog, Tanner. Sarah was most likely in total shock or could have been disassociating. When victims experience something scary, they can sometimes disassociate to protect themselves so they feel disconnected from what's happening. They do this because reality is too difficult to face, and this would be a horrible reality to face. While Sarah was found in the basement, there was still no sign of Tina, Cody, or Stephanie in Matthew's home. So where were they now? Sarah said that when she and Cody returned home from school on Wednesday, they were attacked by Matthew. Sarah had tried to run to her bedroom, but Matthew caught her and dragged her into the basement. There, he found some rope and tied her up. Matthew then left her on the kitchen floor for a period of time, and Sarah said she wasn't sure how long she waited. When Matthew returned, he put Sarah into Stephanie's car. Then he drove her to the college parking lot. He then left Sarah again in the car under a pile of blankets. When he returned, he put her in another car and then took her to his house. Once at his house, Matthew put Sarah's hands in work gloves and bound them with duct tape. He then gagged her and kept her locked in the bathroom and a closet. The bathroom especially was covered in hanging bags of leaves. Finally, Matthew moved Sarah down into the basement. Sarah said that she believed Matthew had killed Tina, Cody, and Stephanie, but wasn't sure. She told the investigators that Matthew had repeatedly assaulted her, cut her finger with a knife, and had said he would release her before Christmas. but he wouldn't tell her what happened to her mother, brother, and her mother's best friend. After Sarah was medically cleared, she was released into her father's custody. Meanwhile, now that Matthew was arrested, he was put on a 24-hour watch because he had threatened to harm himself. But finally, he was brought in to speak with investigators and was interrogated for over 4 days. These interrogations deal with a number of alleged psychological disorders and seem to go on forever. The interrogator started the interrogation by reading Matthew his Miranda rights, but Matthew was completely unresponsive. It's possible that Matthew was in a catatonic state, so the detectives tried different tactics to get Matthew to talk, but nothing worked. The detective even tried pleading with Matthew that the victim's families just wanted answers, but what Matthew did was very odd. Rather than verbally responding, he responded by using hand signals to communicate. It was childlike and bizarre. And from his hand gestures, Matthew seemed to imply that his heart was broken, and this could be a sign of his childlike nature or some kind of weird game. Then Matthew stopped responding again, and detectives went through a whole other gamut of tactics to get him to talk. One of the detectives indicated that maybe Matthew just didn't care, and he began speaking about Matthew like he wasn't in the room to see if he could get him to react. Finally, after not responding for nearly 4 hours, Matthew cracked and said, "I can't tell you anything because I don't know." But Matthew admitted that he knew he must have done something wrong when he found Sarah in his house. Matthew then went on to say that he had tried his best to take care of Sarah. That's an odd way to put it, but a common quality of psychopaths is that they often try to paint themselves as the good guy or the hero in some way. This is a sign of antisocial personality disorder, also known as ASPD. Please note that Matthew was not formally diagnosed, but that's what some assume based on the behaviors that he displayed in this interrogation. So, Matthew told investigators that while Sarah was in his care, he had fed her, let her watch Iron Man, and even let her borrow his copy of the book Treasure Island. At this point in the investigation, Matthew began to cry and claim that he didn't know anything else. On day 2 of the interrogation, a psychologist investigator was brought into the interrogation room. Matthew began talking about his past and how he did some bad things. Matthew then admitted that among other horrible acts, he had burned down a condo and assaulted people. These crimes took place years earlier, and the psychologist reacted by telling Matthew that it's okay. She also added that she knows he didn't want to hurt anybody, again removing the blame from him in order to get him to confess. Matthew repeated back to her that he didn't want to hurt anybody, and then he went on to ask the psychologist about antipsychotic medication. Matthew again said that he must have done something bad if he was in that interrogation room, and again he claimed that he was unaware of his action. It's possible that he was trying to manipulate the investigator, or that he truly didn't know. It's hard to say. However, it's also possible that Matthew had gotten used to disassociating throughout his life. This way, he didn't have to face unpleasant or uncomfortable feelings by just erasing them from his memory. This is a coping technique that children can develop who experience extreme trauma as a child. Also, if you remember, detectives found a ton of leaves in Matthew's house, which could be a sign of schizophrenia. On day 3 of the investigation, a detective was seen sitting very close to Matthew and speaking in a strong and assertive tone. He told Matthew that the second that investigators went to his house and found Sarah, that there was no denying he was guilty. The detective managed to convince him to take a drive to see if he could remember where he took the other victims, but he didn't reveal anything. It could be that Matthew just wanted to escape from the interrogation room, or it could be that he really didn't remember. But the next day, Matthew was again brought back into the interrogation room. The detectives offered him food and coffee. They hoped that Matthew would reciprocate the good deeds, but he didn't even say thank you. The detective asked the psychologist to step out, and then the detective slid his chair closer to Matthew. He told Matthew that if he helped in this case, he would be helpful to him later on. And he even told him that he had advocated for past suspects. That appeared to get Matthew's attention as he finally looked up at the detective for the first time. Matthew then asked if he was being recorded, and the detective lied and told him that he wasn't. Matthew then said that he had to go to the bathroom. The detective took him, and there he said something to him. The other female psychologist returned to the room, and Matthew became concerned that the male detective would tell her what he said to him in the bathroom. The detective said that Matthew told him where the victims were and that he would keep what Matthew said private. Matthew told the detectives that he had a really awful dream the night before. He said that it gave him knots in his stomach. He said he saw some really disgusting stuff in a garbage can and that he wanted to make up some excuse for the detectives to kill him. The other detective then explained to the psychologist that Matthew had had a dream where he was at a meat processing plant, and when he looked in the bags, he saw human body parts. He spoke to the other detective like Matthew was not in the room, again trying to prompt Matthew to respond. And the detective went on to say that he didn't think Matthew had any concerns about the courts or trials. Then the detective said to Matthew that he was offering him a deal, and he told Matthew that if he let the detectives know where the bodies were, he wouldn't tell the other female detective about the offer he had made him in the bathroom. The secret that the detective was keeping was that Matthew wanted the detective to shoot him, and the detective kept this a secret, hoping that in exchange, Matthew would reveal the location of the missing persons, since the detective could clearly not agree to kill him. Then the psychologist took a little bit of a strong arm with Matthew. The psychologist then told Matthew that this is his last chance to talk to them, that pretty soon decisions were going to be made for him in regards to the court system, and she made Matthew feel like having a lawyer would take away his power. There was a knock on the door, and then the detective and psychologist got up to leave. The detective explained that they would now take him back to jail because the attorneys couldn't meet with him in the interrogation room. Matthew later revealed that he made up the dream about the food processing plant where he opened a bag and saw body parts. He admitted it was all a lie to try and get himself killed by police. He said he didn't want to be injected with an antipsychotic medication for the rest of his life, but he said he still didn't know where he had taken the bodies. In a written confession, Matthew admitted a whole lot more. He said that he had staked out Tina's home the night before the attack. He said he was sleeping in the woods across the street from her house. He said the next morning he watched as everyone left, and then he snuck into the home. A truly bone-chilling reveal. Originally, Matthew said his plan was to burglarize the home and sneak away without anyone seeing him. He said he chose Tina's home because she didn't have any close neighbors. However, Stephanie and Tina returned home early and caught him in the act. Matthew then said he ambushed them in a panic. He wrote that he was in a total state of shock. Then he said he slowly walked around the house and came to the realization of what he had done and how bad it was. He then said that he killed Tina's dog because it wouldn't stop barking, but things would only get worse from here. Sarah and Cody returned home. Matthew attacked and killed Cody before tying up Sarah. He said in his letter, "I did not enter the house to kill those people. I did not know a single one of them." After killing Stephanie, Tina, and Cody, Matthew drove to get gas cans with his car with the intention of burning down Tina's house. He was then stopped by an officer who would let him off. He then gave up the plan to burn down the house and instead returned to his house. He said he built a campfire, burned his shoes, and then drank a bottle of wine. On November 8th, Matthew finally gave up the location of the 3 bodies. Now, it's unclear if Matthew's memory finally came back or if he knew this all along. He then described the spot to officers of where he had dumped the bodies. They found a hollow beech tree that had matched Matthew's description. There was a second larger hole near the branches. When the officer looked inside the hole, they spotted what looked like trash bags. The trash bags were filled with Tina, Stephanie, Cody, and the dog. On January 6, 2011, Matthew avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to 10 felonies. After everything that was found, it was clear that Matthew had a bizarre obsession with leaves. Forensic psychologists testified that his leaf obsession was delusional. They also thought that he chose a tree to hide the bodies because it was familiar and comforting to him. Matthew was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Once Sarah was freed from the depths of the most torturous situation, she was supposed to find solace with her father. But it wasn't long after that, her father and stepmother were accused of beating her in 2 incidents at their home in Franklin County's Hamilton Township. And according According to the court records, Sarah's father punched his daughter in the back, and 5 days later, Sarah's stepmom kicked her down a set of stairs. Both defendants appeared in Franklin County Municipal Court on misdemeanor domestic violence and assault charges, and their bail was set at $5,000 for each. And now, a protection order says her father and stepmother must stay away from Sarah. Sarah then moved in with a relative, as well as her half-brothers, ages 7 and 3. 2.5 years after the kidnapping and murder of her family, Sarah appeared on Dr. Phil. The two appeared along with author Robert Scott, who wrote a book titled The Girl in the Leaves. During the taping of the Dr. Phil show, Sarah said she was still adjusting to the loss of her family and that she still had nightmares. She said, "I've got to be strong and just live through it. This poor girl went through so much. We can only hope that she finds some kind of peace." That's all I have for you today. I'm Lindsay, and thanks for watching Killer Bites.